Welcome back to Mr. Lee's lecture on U.S. history and the presentation on FDR, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. So picking back up from where we were last time with FDR, basically we kind of left off, he was talking about the series of measures that he enacted in the first 100 days of his time in office. So we talked about abolishing prohibition, we talked about the bank holidays, we talked about the new stock exchange rules, and now I want to talk a little about his fireside chats. So the fireside chats are something that really left a long-lasting impression on FDR's legacy. He got a lot of credit for them, and so I want to spend a little bit of time on them talking about it. So FDR had this really great public PR idea that he would come out and he would have, the couple news stations that were real time, CBS, NBC, and he would give these weekly or sometimes even bi-weekly chats where he would broadcast himself over the radio and basically give public speech on the radio, kind of give the American people an update about what was going on with the Great Depression, what he was trying to do to fix it, what he could do to help it, and kind of just let them know what was going on in his mind and what the government was trying to do to help them. And so this really good bit of PR had three parts to it. There's the homeliness, the reasonableness, and then the blame. So the homeliness and the reasonableness are kind of the first two steps, and then we'll talk about the blame a little bit. On the homeliness aspect, it was great. People could now hear the president talking to them in their own homes. They didn't have to leave if it was raining in different parts of the country. They didn't have to worry about going outside, to try and hear a public speech. And then Roosevelt also did not have to leave the White House to give these speeches. He could do them right in there, so he didn't have to travel around the country doing all these different tours. He could do it right from the White House, and then he could give his message all across the country. So it's a really, really good way to influence and be able to speak to a lot of the country at a single time, only by giving one speech. Also, because the radio was in each person's home, it kind of felt like he was coming into their homes and delivering almost them. This was something that was really, really new technology in terms of how the president was coming out and reaching the people. Before this, if a president wanted to talk directly to the people, he had to come to their hometown, or they would have to travel to see him. Now FDR comes out with this, and with the fairly new invention of radio that had really only been really pioneered in the last 10 to 15 years, he comes out, he talks on the radio. Now he's almost like he's coming to them. He's reaching out to them. He can reach all these people in their own homes. The reasonableness of the fireside chats, basically, he didn't sugarcoat. He didn't say, everything's going to be okay. He didn't make all these bold claims that the federal government was going to fix everything and that everybody's going to have a job and have these huge savings accounts again. He kind of was a shoot straighter, and he realized that if people wanted to accept what was going on, if people wanted to really change and try to get better, and that if the federal government was really going to be able to do what they need to do, then people need to be able to accept what the federal government was doing. And they also need the backing of the people as well as other people in Congress to get his legislation passed. So he didn't want to make these huge, bold promises. He pretty much just told them straight up, this is what I'm going to try to do. If it doesn't work, we're going to try something else. And he just kept throwing all these different ideas at him. Last but not least, he talked about the blame. He said there's 10% of the people in the country who want the New Deal to fail. They are still okay. These rich people were not greatly affected by the Great Depression for one way or another, and that they just want all these New Deal programs to fail because that means it's more money for them. So Roosevelt claimed that he was fighting the rich on people's behalf, that he was fighting for the success of the majority. So these fireside chats really kind of helped wrap up all these three things and get him working on his message, reaching out to the people. So in his fourth fireside chat in June of 1934, Roosevelt kind of laid out his big three steps for the New Deal, and they were going to be relief, recovery, and reform. And the relief, recovery, and reform programs, known as the 3 R's, were introduced by President Roosevelt, like I said, in 1934, to address the problems of mass unemployment and then also the economic crisis. And the mass unemployment was a big one. Almost a third of the country, 28%, was unemployed at the height of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. So FDR's 3R program, like I said, relief, recovery, reform, they required either immediate, which is relief, temporary, recovery, or permanent actions, that would be reform, and were collectively known as the New Deal. The main programs were initiated by a series of laws that were passed between 1933 and 1938. These initiatives came to be called by historians and also people at times alphabet soup agencies, as they're referred to by acronyms most of the time. I mean, there's literally hundreds of these programs that are out there. I just want to talk about a couple of them. Some of them, emergency relief programs that wanted, quick aid, where it was known as the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, trying to get quick aid to farmers because of the Dust Bowl going on and the terrible drought that was going on in the Midwest. The farmers were really suffering.
He also had the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, basically worked on getting people jobs. Some of the reform programs, which were kind of a temporary solution, worked on providing debt relief and getting industrial recovery and introducing public works. Sorry, these are recovery programs. I can't remember if I said that or not. These are recovery programs. The recovery programs were the National Recovery Administration, NRA. You had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, and then you had the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which is still in existence today. And these programs, basically, especially the Federal Housing Administration, was trying to make sure that people had enough money and income in order to be able to have a house limits. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, because there was so much economic crisis and discomfort going on, that a large amount of people were homeless and living out of their cars. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Dust Bowl, the Okies moving out of the Midwest, and look at some pictures of the Great Depression. But last but not least, with his 3 R's, was the reform. And this was the big one. He wanted to try to make changes to make sure that depression could never happen again. He realized the country was in a really bad way, and that it's possible that it could not survive another one. If something like this happened again, there's going to be a violent revolution, trying to overthrow the government, and it could get really bad. So he created things like the FDIC. We talked about the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, trying to make sure that the banks had enough money to cover the deposits. We talked about the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission reform, wanting to reform the stock market. And then he also created the Social Security Administration, the SSA, which is what we have Social Security for nowadays, so that older people were able to retire and that younger people could come in and take their jobs. So it kind of pushed the older people out. In other words, before this, there was no retirement unless you just happened to save up a bunch of money, which if you were anywhere in the middle or lower class, did not happen. So it allowed older people to have a chance of retirement now, no matter what income level they were at. They could get this money from the government to live off of, and then their jobs would open up so younger unemployed people would now be able to take those jobs. So it was a really, really smart thing for him to kind of come up with. So what I want you to do now is write these 2 questions down on a separate sheet of paper, and then you're going to answer them. We're not going to discuss them or anything like that. I just want you to write down on a separate sheet of paper, and then eventually at the end of the lecture, at the end of the video, these are going to get turned into the baskets. So the first question is, why would Roosevelt's fireside chats be so welcome by the public? You can go back to my part of the lecture on that and see what you think about that and why you think they would be so popular. And then the last bullet there, Roosevelt is often seen as one of the greatest presidents in American history. Why do you think this is? So what have we talked about so far that kind of makes you think that what's the word I'm looking for, that, why would it be deemed one of the greatest presidents? And then the opposite argument, that, and this is just a little bit of extra stuff, is that there have been some historians that have gone back and saying Roosevelt doesn't deserve the title of the greatest president because of his moral character. So Roosevelt, it turns out, had several affairs on his wife, Eleanor, from 1914 to 1918. One of them was actually with his wife's public secretary. And then although they never were officially divorced because it was seen as a really bad public move at the time, they lived apart for the rest of their lives. Despite making public appearances from that, Eleanor did not care for him. She didn't want to live with him. She didn't want anything to do with him. And then in 1942, later on in his life, when Roosevelt only had a couple years left, he knew his health was failing. He tried to get back together with Eleanor. He asked, can you move back in with me? We'll try for reconciliation. And she just flat out denied him. Like I said, she didn't really want anything to do with him. She said, we can keep making these public appearances together for the sake of your presidency, but I'm not going to move back in with you. And so when Roosevelt dies in 1945, he actually dies with his mistress, Lucy, by his bed, and not his current quote-unquote wife, even though they'd been living apart for some time. So a lot of historians have kind of gone back and looked at these different questions about whether the moral aspect of his character, does that take away anything that he does as a president. So think about those questions for a couple minutes and answer them in 2 to 3 sentences each. And then when you're ready, you can just hit play and we can move on to the next part. So now we're going to talk about the opposition to the New Deal a little bit and some people who were critics of the New Deal. One of the major ones was Huey Long. He was a Louisiana senator in the 1930s, from 1932 to 1935, huge popular politician in the South. And he was one of the few ones who kind of thought that FDR was not doing enough. He did not think that FDR, he thought that FDR had made an insufficient compromise, that he didn't deserve all the credit he was getting, and that he should really do more. So he wanted to heavily tax the rich, redistribute the wealth to the poor, use all this money to help build roads, hospitals, all that stuff. And then he also wanted to make sure that school children would get free textbooks. The schools did not have to pay for the textbooks. So he was really big on all this stuff. And he was also noted for advocating to help both poor blacks and poor whites, which is a very, very radical thing at the time, not just helping out the average American person, but also the lower income. So this was huge on his point. He was actually assassinated in 1935 for his controversial views. Second up was the Republican and business community. Obviously, just like today, if the opposite party proposes something, the other party is going to go against it just because that's what they do, unfortunately. So basically, they thought FDR was behaving too much like a dictator, that too many codes and regulations, that if high taxes discourage high work. You have that argument nowadays all the time about whether, put a 50% plus tax on millionaires. Is that a good idea? Does it discourage people from trying to get something? Does it discourage jobs to go elsewhere? All that stuff. And they really tried to attack FDR and connect his policies with fascist or communist policies with Hitler and Stalin. That was the kind of the push they really want to try to associate with him. Obviously, it did not really work, but it did allow a little bit of a change in terms of how FDR's policies were passed, because after 1938, a lot of his New Deal legislation was hard to get through. This also is in part because of the breakout of World War II. So, last kind of resistance to FDR's plan was his Supreme Court packing plan. And this wasn't something that was in direct relation to FDR, but kind of a public outburst. So, in 1932, with the election of FDR, Democrats also gained control of Congress, and then so because Democrats had control of Congress and the executive branch, a lot of the New Deal legislation that FDR wanted to pass, they were easily passed. However, in 1936, the Supreme Court actually declared some of Roosevelt's programs in the New Deal unconstitutional. They said they went against, they were overreaching power of the federal government, and they shouldn't be allowed to exist. So Roosevelt obviously was not very happy about this. He wanted to see what he could do to try and get these programs passed no matter what. So he proposed legislation that would appoint judges to the Supreme Court, and he would add a justice to the Supreme Court for every member currently over 70 years old and 6 months. And because the Supreme Court is a lifelong position, this was, in theory, it helped even out the court as certain members got older and make it easier for them to retire. However, people saw it for where it really was, especially Republican members of Congress and the public at large. They were very much against it. They thought he was trying to pack the Supreme Court, because Roosevelt was basically trying to add in justices that would support his programs, because those are the ones that he would appoint. So it was made with great resistance by the public, and it never made it out of the Senate. Never even close to becoming a law. So that kind of brought down the big resistance to FDR's New Deal programs. So last question here that you guys are also going to write on that same sheet of paper as before and answer them. So in total, you should have 3 questions written down and 3 questions answered. This question is, why do you think people attacked Roosevelt over his plans? Why do you think that there was so much resistance to them? Do you think that those plans were a good idea? Do you think it was just people being political? Or do you think that they thought that these programs would really hurt America? So go ahead and answer that and then turn these questions into the basket. Thank you so much.